I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Good evening everyone, and welcome to the 39th International AIDS Candlelight Memorial. My name is Tass Mousaferiadis and I'm your MC for this event tonight. This event is brought to you by Living Positive Victoria, Positive Women Victoria, and is coordinated by the Global Network of People Living with HIV. The Global Network of People Living with HIV is one of the oldest grassroots mobilisation campaigns for HIV awareness, beginning back in 1983. On this day, the third Sunday in May, we are by no means alone. We are a coalition of around 1,200 communities and across 120 different countries. We stand together today, or as in our case, as we watch our devices. The theme of this memorial is Living, Learning, Loving 40 Years of HIV. In recognising this important anniversary, we also acknowledge in the theme words of living, learning and loving that we have continued to live and have fulfilling lives living with HIV. We have learned so much both individually and as a community through living with HIV. And we love and are loved whilst living with HIV. This event tonight will be very special. We will hear from some amazing speakers, hear some fascinating conversations, and some beautiful music from the LowRez Male Choir conducted by Ursula Pays. You will also hear from Professor Suzanne Crowe from the Burnett Institute in conversation with Judith Gorst, John and Susan from the Positive Speakers Bureau, and the many community members who have lent their voices for tonight's event. I am honoured to be involved with tonight's Candlelight Memorial. When David O'Keefe contacted me to ask me to MC tonight's event, I really thought I was seeing a spam email. And believe me, I get plenty of those. When I got over the fact that this invitation was not spam, and in fact was genuine, I felt humbled to find myself in this position and both privileged and honoured to take this on, especially after the so many esteemed people who have previously performed this role before me and have been part of this extraordinary organisation. Many of you I now regard as my friends. Before I go any further, I wish to thank David O'Keefe for all of his work in making this happen today. Richard Keane, the LPV Chief Executive, and Christabel Miller, the LPV Board Chair, for this invitation, I thank you. My relationship with this organisation goes a long, long way back. And my relationship with this organisation is all about intersections. Intersections with passionate people who have worked here, have led the organisation, received services from the organisation, or just received inspiration. I could start naming people, but I would be here for a very long time. But I will anyway. Please allow me to acknowledge the amazing work of previous CEOs Brent Allen and Sonny Williams, and board directors Paul Kidd, Greg Iverson, and Ian Muchamore. And of course, some of the staff who've been here forever, like Vic Perry and the now retired Max Niggle and Susie Malhotra. I'm in awe of your work and I salute you. Your contributions go way beyond this organisation and have had an impact both nationally and internationally. I've simply lost count of the number of events I have personally attended associated with this organisation. They include, to name a few, the candlelight vigils from when they first began and we met outside the Melbourne Town Hall and marched along Swanston Street and St Kilda Road with people like Phil Carswell, Tom Carter and the late Ian Goller. Or the Saturday afternoon treatment workshops conducted by the fabulous Vanessa Wagner. They were so much fun. The many quilt unfoldings and there's so many other events hosted by this very organisation with people like David Menadue and John Day. And of course, my partner in crime, on Joy Radio's Saturday magazine, David McCarthy, aka Macca, who emceed this event just a few years ago on South Bank and was also a former CEO of this very organisation. Together, we've covered numerous stories about HIV featuring this organisation and its people. A few years ago, Melbourne's very own continuing community cultural icon, or as I like to refer to him as CCCI, and everyone knows that I'm speaking about Brenton Gayer, he asked me to be an Enough ambassador. Well, how could I say no to that? And of course, Brenton has been a regular guest on our show on Joy's Saturday magazine, providing us with the best arts commentary, LPV updates, and just a bit of gossip. My personal involvement with HIV began in 1986 when I was seconded to the Victorian Health Department to develop and roll out education resources, programs and policies for Victorian schools about the prevention of HIV and STIs. That was both an interesting and a frightening time, signposted by the infamous Grim Reaper TV ad, when community angst about HIV was high and stigma was at its peak. As my personal career in the public service evolved, some of my highlights with this work of this organisation include developing and building fabulous relationships with community leaders like John Day and David Menadue, facilitating engagement between this community and the Victorian Government, and helping to navigate the establishment of key opportunities like setting up HIV/AIDS Ministerial Advisory Committee, the approval of a statewide policy and strategy, and advocating for program funding. I've always enjoyed being part of this organisation and being connected to its work. Occasionally, the computer would get it wrong and send me the ballots for the LPV board elections. But as you know, as an associate member, I'm not eligible to vote, and I of course refrain from doing so. I always looked forward to receiving POSLink in the mail and reading David Menadue's writing, which by the way, I think is the very best. A former board director told me a few years back that I just happened to be one of the organisation's longest associate members. I'm not sure if this is still true or the case, but in my mind, I wear this badge with pride. We now know more about HIV and its impacts than ever before. But I, like many others here today, acknowledge there's still a lot to do. The work is not over. And while we manage our way in these extraordinary times with the current COVID-19 pandemic, there are many, many more lessons to learn. COVID has brought to sharp focus once again the inequalities in our society and the impacts inequality can have on our health. Lately, I've enjoyed listening to Professor Bill Botel's reflections on lessons learned from HIV and their application to COVID. Next, I would like to introduce Living Positive Victoria's Chief Executive, Richard Keane. Richard has a long association with this organisation and has a long and proud involvement in HIV work. Richard will speak about the importance of this day and what it means for the community.
In many ways, 2020 tested all of us. Here in Victoria, we had to adapt and find new ways to engage our members and supporters. Last year's Candlelight Memorial was an unexpected success for Living Positive Victoria. Over 1,500 people accessed the live stream, extending our reach to engage rural and outer suburban members for the first time via a virtual platform, which we have retained for this event in 2021. This unique event holds personal importance to me and many people in our community, including our partners, families, friends, allies, and supporters. It provides an opportunity to reflect on the past, be grateful for today, and to look to the future with renewed optimism. If this year's virtual Candlelight Memorial is the first time you've been able to access this event, I'd like to welcome you for joining us and thank all of you for your attendance. Music has the capacity to move us in so many ways. It can take us to a different time and place. It can remind us of a loved one or a special person in our lives. It can make us laugh or cry. Music speaks to us in a different way to a speech. It taps into our emotions. It allows us to be taken on a journey. It also allows us to move differently through dance, and for many people, singing that favourite song lets us bond with friends old and new. The role of music has been central to the International AIDS Candlelight Memorial, and we at Living Positive Victoria feel very privileged to have had the LowRez Choir perform at the Candlelight Memorial since 2014. Over the past 7 years, the music of the choir has brought joy to so many of us who have attended the Candlelight Memorial. Through your singing, you have helped us both celebrate and commemorate the lives of those who have passed due to HIV and those still living with HIV. On behalf of Living Positive Victoria, I would like to thank all the singers here today who have performed such wonderful songs. I would also like to acknowledge past members of the choir who are not with us. A very special thank you to the President of LowRez, Michael Horden, the Musical Director, Ursula Paez, and the Chief Accompanist, Jeff Urquhart. We appreciate all that you have done to make this such a special event, and we look forward to engaging with you into the future.
Thank you, Richard Keane. And now I'd like to introduce the LowRez Male Choir, who will perform the song Seasons of Love from the musical Rent.
$525,600 minutes, 525,000 moments so dear, 525,600 minutes. How do you measure a year? In daylights, in sunsets, in midnights, in cups of coffee, in inches, in miles, in laughter, in strife. In 525,600 minutes, how do you measure a year in the life? How about love? How about love? How about love? Measuring love. Seasons of sing out, the story never ends. Let's celebrate, remember a year in the life of friends. Remember the love. Remember the love. Remember the love. Measuring love. Seasons of
Candlelight Memorial to me is a chance to remember, reflect on and think about the heroes and advocates of the past, to think about the many beautiful lives that were lost far too soon, and to reflect on the fact that as long as people living with HIV continue to experience stigma and discrimination, we all have a job to do.
There's a huge importance to the candlelight vigils and remembering those who are no longer with us and those who are still living with HIV. And that's because of what the HIV epidemic meant to our communities and what it still does even today. So many people were not given the space or agency to be themselves, to get proper support within the healthcare system and to be with their loved ones or be supported. And even though a lot has changed, that's still the way for so many people today. And that's why candlelight vigils and remembering those that are no longer with us, and also remembering the circumstances that they went through not that long ago, is so very important. And it's wonderful that we as a community can come together to mark those individuals, to mark those moments, to take that time to lift them up and to create space for them, because we still don't create enough of that space, even today.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Suzanne Crowe from the Burnet Institute and Judith Gorst, both of whom are well known to our community and have worked in HIV since the 1980s. Suzanne and Judith will reflect on their experience working in clinical practice and in healthcare over the last 40 years.
Hi, I'm Judith and we're here for the Candlelight Memorial. I'm a nurse and I'm a family therapist, and Suzanne, you're...
Hello, I'm Suzanne and it's lovely to be here this evening. I'm an infectious diseases physician and an HIV researcher, and Judith and I have been working together for many years. We were together back in the very early days of the HIV epidemic at Fairfield Hospital.
We were.
And I wonder if you'd just like to share some of those memories.
Sure. I've got so many intense, powerful memories of those times. Most of all, thinking back about how desperately unwell the patients were and how the virus affected them, and both physically, the physical disfigurement of this illness.
Yeah.
I'm sure you remember people with Kaposi's, the way they lost their ability to walk, lost their ability to see, lost their ability to, all their bodily functions, in fact, were impacted at that time. I can also remember scores of really beautiful, often very young men, gay men, and how they bore this physical disfigurement with such dignity, and the suffering that they experienced, and often had to look at death and think about death in such a courageous fashion.
And there were some women too. Do you remember some of the early women?
In a way that was, well, I think as a woman, and I'm sure you would have found this as well, it was particularly acute in a sense, because they felt that they weren't enfolded by the gay community, that they were very much on their own, and they came from such disparate groups, and I think each one of them felt that they were the only one with this diagnosis at that time. So it was very, very hard for them.
And the quilt, do you remember the quilt and the candlelight vigil?
I'm sure you would have remembered walking up through the city to the exhibition buildings at that time where the quilt was laid out, and how the grief, the outpouring of grief that was experienced by people.
And we would go to so many funerals during that time. Remember that? Yeah.
We did. We went to so many funerals, which I don't think I'd ever been to a funeral of one of my patients before HIV came along. I'm not sure whether you went to funerals before HIV.
No, it
wasn't something that as nurses or as doctors we would consider doing at all.
That's right. And yet somehow these patients managed to maintain their sense of humour. And I can remember one patient in particular, in Ward 4. And Ron Lucas was an old HIV doc who was the consultant physician at the time. And this patient would say to him, oh, Ron, if I weren't in hospital, I'd take you out on a date. And Ron was married, and he'd just say, oh, I'm too old for you. To which this patient would say, oh, but I love antiques.
Oh, that's so typical of those times, with the humour that people displayed, and the gay humour particularly. I think that was sometimes something that kept us all alive and looking at a different aspect of, it wasn't all completely doom and gloom from that point of view.
That's true. And then remember the Fairfield Hospital itself. It was just an amazing campus. It was like a like a country club in many ways, and beautiful grounds. There were lovely trees. There were gorgeous gardens. There were ducks running around. There were the peacocks from the golf club over the road.
That's right.
It liked the gardens at Fairfield better, so they would come across. And in the early days that I was at Fairfield, it used to be that the wards were filled with people who were there just for a short time and who got better. They had glandular fever or hepatitis or measles or whooping cough, and then all of a sudden that was transformed overnight. And Ward
with
4,
HIV, with
that's
HIV
right.
patients coming.
That's right. Ward 4 was full of these young men who were basically dying, and we would have to try and get used to a totally different way of dealing with people. There were men who hadn't told their families. There were men whose partners would come in, and it was before you had gay marriage, of course, and it was before these partners were respected. And
there was such discrimination at that time as well, Suzanne. I think that's something we tend to forget, that the fear around the diagnosis and the discrimination that people experience with the diagnosis.
That's exactly right. And yet there was this culture of care at Fairfield, where there was no discrimination by the staff there, the nurses and the doctors, or by any of the people who worked in the wards. And I think that the fear, you're quite right, Judith, I think that part of that fear was driven by the fact that we didn't know much in those days. And so it was that lack of knowledge that really underpinned the fear.
You're absolutely right. So there was the lack of knowledge, and there was also, from my point of view, I'm thinking back to those days around, it was such a steep learning curve from the point of view of both how we were going to manage people and manage the infection, but also from my point of view, the whole lack of knowledge or understanding I had around looking after people from the LGBTI community, people who injected drugs. I hadn't had a whole lot of experience before going to work at Fairfield of encountering these different marginalised, stigmatised groups of people.
That's right. So, and the women in particular. In the beginning, there weren't that many women that I was looking after. I think for the first couple of years, it was predominantly gay men or men who identified as being bisexual. But every now and then, a woman would come into the clinic with HIV infection, and that was even tougher. It was tough for doctors, it was tough for the women, because they didn't really, they weren't able to enrol in clinical trials.
That's true.
Yeah, and they were treated as if their illness was the same as that for a gay man, and yet was so different in many ways. They might have had thrush, or they might have had queries about pregnancy, and we couldn't encourage pregnancy in those days because we didn't know the risks that were involved, either for the woman or for the child.
Absolutely.
And the women themselves, I can remember that how stigmatised they were, because it was felt that if they were a woman with HIV, well, they must be a sex worker or they must be an injecting drug user. And that actually wasn't the case.
Yes, it wasn't the case at all. But it was the perception that society held around what a diagnosis of HIV meant, which was so stigmatising and so marginalising.
And there was so much judgment.
So much judgment.
And there was so much we didn't know. And in fact, doctors were quite powerless at the time. I can remember the fact that we had an HIV test, but we really didn't know what it meant. You know, if you had a positive test, did that mean that it would it indicated recent infection, or did it mean that your body just hadn't got round to eradicating the virus? Would it stay positive for life? Would everyone with an HIV positive test go on to develop AIDS? We just didn't know that.
We didn't know.
And we also didn't know about the treatment. We were learning about managing these unusual opportunistic infections, and there were certainly clinical trials that helped us with how to make a diagnosis for these infections that we'd never seen before, and for the treatment for those. And back at Fairfield, we did some of those early trials ourselves back there, but there was so little we could actually offer. There was no treatment per se for the virus, and so we were basically left with trying to provide support, friendship, understanding, kindness, respect,
compassion. Yeah,
that's right. Allowing these people, often who are going to die, but giving them dignity, respecting their partners, helping them deal with family issues right at the end. It was a really tough time.
It was a very tough time. And also I think thinking of the dignity and trying to helping people decide how to tell their families and discuss this with their partners, because I think the perception was that a diagnosis equated with a death sentence, and so it did, and it was young people having to face things that normally it was sort of outside the right sort of sequence of events for what we'd expect normally in a normal course of our lifetime.
They were in the prime of their life.
They were in the prime.
And it was also, Judith, I don't know if you'll agree with me here, but it was also part of that culture of care was breaking down the traditional hierarchy between doctors and nurses. We were all working together. We were all learning together.
I'm glad you said that, because that's one of the things that I think was really, I found particularly engaging about working, is that the medical experts didn't have all the answers. So there was the whole feeling of collaboration and consultation. So we consulted, the doctors would talk to the nurses, they'd also talk to the patients. And patients absolutely demanded to have some form of sort of decisions in what they were prepared to go through, or what they decided they wanted in the way of being looked after. And what they wanted, their outcomes.
That's almost a legacy that they've left. I mean, we now realise, I think, thanks to those very well-educated, well-informed people that we were working with as our patients, who were not only asking questions but often telling us the sort of management that they wanted as well.
Yes.
It was an important lesson for the medical profession and the nursing profession.
Absolutely. That you actually talked and we engaged and had a conversation about it, rather than being sort of telling them this is what we're going to do next. And I think that's a really wonderful legacy of HIV, if there is such. You know, there's always going to be some positives that come out of very dark times.
That's
so
right.
That's definitely one of them.
And it wasn't just doctors working with nurses. We were also working with the social workers like Jan Watson back in those days, and with dietitians. Even the Catholic nuns were involved.
Who were marvellous.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, they were marvellous.
And then we were working with the gay community themselves, and the activists in the community. And then the general practice response was amazing, because it was, in those very early days, it was predominantly the gay GPs who really stepped up. A number of them had HIV, and some of them even had AIDS.
Yes.
And then we all had to work together with politicians. We had to learn how to work with politicians.
We did.
And there was an alliance that wasn't always comfortable, but it was there. It was between the health community, the medical community, between the gay community and the activists, between the politicians and the media.
So, Suzanne, thinking about some of the personal and professional things that you can recall and remember about those times, I'm just wondering what your thoughts were.
Oh, well, from a personal perspective, those days were really tough emotionally, the early days. And I think I gave up trying not to cry with my patients. I mean, I learnt that you could still be professional and offer them professional care and support and look after them through a few tears. And I think they understood that as well. And I think that time also, from a personal level, it shaped a lot of my friendships for the future. And in fact, I even met my husband through HIV.
Oh, really?
He was well, he was a doctor in San Francisco, working on the early HIV epidemic.
Yes.
And we got married, and he came back to live in Australia.
Lovely. It's so interesting you say that. I do remember lots of tears, but on a personal level, I remember meeting a new date, and you sort of spoke about where you worked. You were a nurse, and you can see their little eyes light up. And then when you mentioned that you worked at Fairfield Hospital, or you worked with people living with HIV, you could almost visibly, physically see the withdrawal, and as if to say that you're working with this group equated with a positive diagnosis for yourself as well. So it was quite I remember quite clearly getting some quite negative responses, unlike you, where you met your husband, for instance.
Well, I was lucky, I think. But
you were very lucky. You were very lucky,
yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm just thinking maybe we should also think a bit about how HIV clearly has shaped your career on a professional level as well.
Well, it probably sounds a bit trite to say it, but I think I've been living and breathing HIV since the days that Anne Mitch and I started the first HIV clinic. Well, in fact, it was the gay men's clinic first of all, and then it became the AIDS clinic out at Fairfield Hospital.
Right. So that was a long time ago.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, in fact, I feel really honoured to have been part of the continuum right from the beginning, back in those days when there was a lot of sadness and fear, and then through the excitement when we first got AZT, and then the disappointments when we had one after the other of these sequential monotherapies that you know everyone became resistant to. And then all of a sudden, I think it was in the in fact it was 1996 when we got the
major breakthrough
That's
in
right.
treatments.
Absolutely.
Effective treatments.
Yeah,
yes.
effective treatments. And from then on, we've now got PrEP. Most people with HIV these days are able to live almost normal lives. And in fact, many medical students and many young doctors will go through their medical career without ever seeing a patient with AIDS. So it's really changed enormously. And I think from the research perspective, because I've also been involved in research from the beginning, when I came back from San Francisco and started the first HIV lab out at the Burnett Institute, seeing patients at the same time was really important for my research because it really shaped that research. And, you know, the little pieces that we're adding to the jigsaw puzzle weren't always enormous, but I'd see patients in the clinic that have problems. I'd come back over to the lab and I'd say to my team, you know, what can we do? And we'd get funding. That was always difficult, but we'd get funding and then do the research and publish it and
come up with
add a bit more
new treatments.
That's
yes.
right.
No,
yeah.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting you talking like that because I think I've stuck around in working with people living with HIV and in this sector for lots of reasons, but probably mostly because I like the patients and I like the people I work with. But also I think it was, I think what I really feel is that we were doing something that really, really mattered and that this was so important at the time that when so little was known and there was so much stigma and marginalisation and there was so little that could be done, that it was important to work and try and make things a little bit better.
Yeah.
And it sort of made me think about my beliefs and values in a different way, and that how we as individuals and society form opinions and how these opinions can be really quite unhelpful in the broader perspective of how we look at human beings and what's important.
That's really
down here.
true. And I think that there have been some legacies that have been left. We mentioned one earlier, but I know these days I'm looking back now at the early HIV epidemic and seeing how that's what the similarities are with COVID. And for a start, there was a lot of fear, which we've talked about with HIV, and that fear was in the community, but it was also in the medical profession. And I know that it was partly because we didn't really understand in the very beginning how HIV was transmitted. But you'd get in the public hospitals at times that the food trays were left at the door of patients.
Oh, yes.
And then there was phobia, obviously, as well. It was part of the fear. And we had to try and find surgeons who weren't making excuses for why they wouldn't operate on patients with HIV.
I remember that so well.
Yeah. And with COVID, similar sorts of fears. You know, we didn't want to go to the supermarket. We were worried about bringing home bags that might be contaminated. We had to learn
wipe down the bags when
That's
you
right.
got back from the supermarket.
That's right. We've had to wear PPE, just like we've had to learn with HIV, wearing gloves. So there have been all these changes to clinical practice as well. And I think it also, both HIV and COVID have exposed the weaknesses in our healthcare system. And they both also involved marginalised communities.
Absolutely. And that's really interesting, isn't it? The way that the parallel with the marginalised and the people who are less able to look after themselves.
Well, particularly in Victoria, just with the comparison with COVID, it's been the communities where English is a second language, where there's been insecure housing, where visas are problems, and that's resulted in some of the major outbreaks. But that's enough for the legacies. Judith, I think we're almost out of time.
I think we are.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, you mentioned privilege. I think it is. I feel hugely privileged to have been able to work in this sector for my career, and it's been something which will stay with me forever. And I can still have strong images of the people I've known, the people I've come into contact with, both patients and families and partners, as well as the medical profession. So it's been a real honour. So I think that's what
where you'll finish.
What about you? Because you've seen so many changes as well.
I think I'd just like to emphasise how far we've come in a relatively short time, Judith. Remember, so long ago, there were a person who was gay would be talking to their parents and saying, "I'm gay and I've got AIDS," in the same breath. And now someone who's HIV positive is more likely to be saying to their family, "I'm getting married and I'm going to have a baby."
Absolutely. And we would never have imagined that.
No, that's right. Thank you, Judith. This has been fun today. In fact, it's been more fun than I thought it was going to be. I really enjoyed catching up and reminiscing about the past.
Absolutely, Suzanne. I've enjoyed it too, thinking back to those times. It seems a long time ago, but also very, very recent as well.
Well, we won't leave it so long before we see each other again.
No,
thank you,
that would be
Judith.
nice.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Suzanne and Judith, for supporting Living Positive Victoria and this Candlelight Memorial. I'd like to now introduce LowRez Choir, who will sing Beautiful City from the musical Godspell.
Out of the ruins and rubble, out of the smoke, out of a night of struggle, can we see a ray of hope? One pale thin ray, reaching for the day. We can build a beautiful city. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We can build a beautiful city. Not a city of angels, but we can build a city of man. We may not reach the ending, but we can start. We can start slowly but truly bending, brick by brick, heart by heart. Love may be now. We start learning how we can build a beautiful city. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We can build a beautiful city. Not a city of angels, but we can build a city of man. When your trust is all but shattered, when your faith is all but killed, you can give up, bitter and battered, or you can slowly start to build a beautiful city. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We can build a beautiful city. Not a city of angels, but finally a city of man. A city of man.
Today, being the Candlelight Memorial Day, reminds me of two things. Firstly, to celebrate and to remember the people that have died to the disease in the past. Their struggles and pain has been the reason why people of my generation are surviving and thriving today. But also to shed a bit of light about the people still living with the virus. I think the activism and the advocacy is what is making us have a better community. I just want to say on the Candlelight Memorial Day that I thank everyone that has contributed in one way or the other, whether living with the disease or working in the community to make our life a better one. Thank you.
The Candlelight Memorial is really a chance for us to honour and respect those who we've lost over the years, but also to honour those who continue to live with stigma throughout this ongoing pandemic. So really, if there was any time for community to get together and be together, it is now.
The Candlelight Memorial means to me that it is time for us to remember and to reflect all the struggles and all the fight that we carried on to get to this stage where in Australia we can live with a healthy lifestyle regardless of our HIV status. In saying that, we also need to remember that there are millions of people in the world that are still affected by HIV and they are still dying of AIDS. In the time of the global pandemic, where the focus is on COVID-19, we also need to remember that the fight is not over. Living in a lucky country like Australia, we still need to remember and carry the fight towards other people and communities that don't have the same privilege that we have. It is time for us to remember, it is time for us to reflect, and it is also time for us to celebrate all the achievements that we've done so far. International Candlelight Vigil is the time for us to get together despite of our differences and for us to work together as a community.
We're now going to hear from two speakers from Living Positive Victoria's Positive Speakers Bureau. John and Susan will talk about the realities of being diagnosed with HIV, the challenges of living with HIV, the stigma associated with it, and their hopes for the future.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I've been living with HIV now for over 30 years, and with me today is John, and you've been diagnosed a bit longer than me.
Since 1984, one of the first people in the country.
Wow. That was that.
Genesis 1. It's just referred to.
Yeah, that would have been hard in those days, huh?
Really tough, yeah. I remember the doctor just said, that's your diagnosis, and go away and cram as much life as you can in 1 to 3 years, and virtually you got no hope. There was no follow-up counselling from the doctor offered. No even follow-up blood testing. So I remember I did 1 year at uni. I got into Melbourne Uni, did 1 year at uni under a lot of duress, no support, family were overwhelmed. And then I decided to go back to the UK, I'd been once before, just with an open-ended one-way ticket, just, you know, do a lot of travelling. I did some singing and engaged in some passions, and yeah, that was the start of dealing with it all. What about you, Susan?
Well, it was really scary because I was a few years after you, but I was a single parent with a toddler, and I was being told I had 3 to 5 years to live. So I didn't expect my son to see my son finish primary school. But I also then threw myself into, I mean, I was fortunate that there was a peer support group established then, and I did get in touch really early, which I think is really valuable. And I threw myself into, you know, the management committees and goodness knows what, which also meant that then I was just surrounded by scores and scores of people with HIV who then started dying, and the deaths, the number of deaths, and that's what, you know, I think today's about, is remembering. I mean, I've lost more than 100 friends and colleagues because I also got involved in Asia and the Pacific in terms of training people in advocacy and whatnot. So, yeah, it was a very difficult journey before the antiretrovirals were available.
Well, I can relate to that because I lost about 7 or 8 really close-knit friendships. Yeah. People I did with both sexes, and I didn't know you know, they were positive at all. And a couple of friends in particular, there was this vitamin C injections you could have because there was no treatment.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing a couple of my friends down there, and you know, despite vitamin C injections, they had 0 T cells, and it was just really overwhelming to see them there, and I couldn't offer them anything. And then 2 months later, I knew that they'd passed. So, and then another one. So it was really just so difficult to process the whole thing at the time.
I think for many of us that have lived through those pre-antiretroviral drug availability times, I think we've got a bit of PTSD for sure, because I know that my feelings of grief. I think when the drugs became available, then it was trying to get them to everywhere around the world and make sure we get generics, and that has made a big difference. And I think it's even changed. I don't know about you, but I think community stigma has started to shift over the last decade or so.
Well, I think it's not an automatic death sentence as it was perceived back in the early days. It's more become a chronic manageable disease. There involves some self-discipline, adhering to medication and so forth, obviously, and just looking over your general health. But it has shifted, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I took antiretrovirals for the first time at the very end of the 90s. And because I had only 50 CD4 cells at the time, and a viral load of over 4 million copies per microliter, I was really, you know, I would have died in 2000. But because I saw the amazing difference that it made to me, I hope that people who are diagnosed and put on meds value them. And also the new stuff that we realise that if we have an undetectable viral load, we are untransmissible. Correct. So we cannot pass the virus on to others. Yeah. Whew, what a difference that...
It's a huge relief, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I know, because we were always the ones, the carriers.
The branded ones, I think. Yeah, it's like you're carrying around this. That's correct. 4 million viral load, that's incredible, if you don't mind me saying that you're still here, because that's the highest viral load I've ever heard.
Yeah.
I didn't go on any medication for the first 18 years. Like, I've been positive for 37. Just put my head in the sand. I was worried about drug side effects, and like when AZT first came on the scene, a lot of people died from going on AZT because as it came to light that they were giving doses to people that weren't compatible with human life. It came out in the British Lancet.
The doses were
way too high. So that contributed to a lot of unnecessary deaths, you know. Yeah, so, but I got to a point after 18 years that I thought, well, I had a couple of things, ulcers in my mouth that wouldn't go away, and I had to go and get it all, you know, see where I was at. And I still had about 200 T cells, but viral load about 78,000. But I really struggled to get my viral load down to undetectable. And I think it's worth noting that I received a bit of a gift from a healthcare professional who was an HIV nurse at the time. And I'd been on my first course of drugs, and I gained some drug resistance, and then a second and a third lot, and drug resistance again. And this HIV nurse suggests that I go back onto one of the first lot of drugs that I took and see if that would help me get my viral load down to undetectable, and it did. So that was pretty amazing. And then I went to my doctor. Actually, I should tell you first that I went to my doctor and said, look, this HIV nurse is Richard, his colleague's his name. He has recommended, you know, as a suggestion that I go on this earlier drug that I had previous drug resistance. And I think it's just a good exercise in being proactive with medical professionals. I said, well, come on, Norm, let's try this drug. What have I got to lose? And it worked. Yeah. And ever since I've been undetectable, so over 20 years. So it's great.
one of the first drugs I was on was AZT combined with 3TC and nevirapine, which isn't given very much anymore, but it's a very simple drug and very cheap as chips. Apparently, I'm saving the government lots of money being on it, you know, for over a decade. But I think even though I think community stigma it's changed, I still think there's a lot of self-stigma around the diagnosis. And I think most of us don't even recognise how much we stigmatise ourselves. I mean, I've been very active in the community, but I do realise that in many ways I have, you know, like assumed that people are going to sort of run away from me like, you know, ants when you tap a table, or, you know.
Sure.
And I think people who are diagnosed today, I think many of them still carry that self-stigma and don't realise that they cannot transmit it to anybody else once they get onto the drugs. But it's a heavy one. I mean, particularly, you know, negotiating relationships and, you know, if you're coming from, born in a different country that has a different culture where there's a lot more stigma around, it's still a tough diagnosis to deal with, even though I call it a chronic manageable condition. Yeah, it's not easy. And a lot of people I know in our support group for women have been diagnosed late in their HIV progression. Yeah. And my heart goes out for women who've been, or for anybody who's been diagnosed with HIV during the last year or so with COVID.
Absolutely.
How's that been for you?
I do know of one person in particular that has been diagnosed in the last 12 months, since back in May last year. And I think it's just been almost going back in time with the HIV, where there was no support. I think getting it in, you know, with the advent of COVID, I think it's just been that double whammy thing, because we didn't know, we still don't know whether, you know, whether we're more at risk. The feeling is the information we've had to date is that we're no more at risk than anyone else with COVID. But I think initially, when this particular person I know of as an acquaintance became HIV positive, there was this double whammy anxiety thing with them. Yeah.
Oh, I think it would have been terrible. I mean, even as just a woman living alone, because my son works in London now, I found it really, really challenging. We lost a peer, Dolores Dockery. She's very well known. She'd been living with HIV, running the Hyacinth group in New York. She died from COVID. And I think for those of us, like, HIV was a very slow, progressive epidemic. And this one kind of rushed in.
Yes.
And in the past, we've been able to hold each other. And I think that's the thing that I've found really difficult in the last 12 months, is the lack of being able to hold and hug and,
good point. Yep.
yeah, touch each other and reach out. But fortunately, I think our peer support workers are still, you know, at it out there, and there is a lot more active peer support, peer navigation than existed in those days. It was just whoever you knew, wasn't it?
It's really evolved, peer support. It's a lot more tailored these days to specific groups, whether it's mature age people like ourselves, you know, long-termers, and it's geared to, there's like a holistic approach and a lot of brainstorming, networking approach. And you go to a peer support group and they'll have a guest speaker talking about diet or about some issues like osteoporosis, which we're more prone to. We're in a higher risk category than somebody that's 60. So the information's really good. They're really valuable.
Yeah.
But in the early days, it was pretty much just you're in a group in a room with other people, and they were just really overwhelmed with the diagnosis, and there was no hope. There was very little information. So it's really evolved, yeah.
You know, I was working with a group of women last weekend, and one woman had only been diagnosed 3 months ago, and it was great that she'd come to the event. And I think another woman had been diagnosed over 20 years ago, but had only recently got involved. So I think when women do, or when people do come and meet others, even though you might not have anything else in common, it's a relief to realise. And for me to meet with people who've been living with it long term, for me it's just a solidarity because of the people we've lost and the people we remember on a day like today, because they made amazing contributions, and if it wasn't for the work that many of them had done, and the community response to HIV, we'd never be quite where we are today, I don't think.
That's well put. What are your views about the ongoing issue of isolation with a lot of people, including myself at different stages?
Do you mean
in my
apart
life?
from the COVID era? You mean?
Well as COVID. I think it's...
Yeah, it's a double whammy, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, because many people are living with HIV longer and getting older, and you know, as you said, having maybe less mobility. Yeah, I mean, I'm not fully aware of how. I think the services are quite amazing. I mean, what do you think about isolation as we grow older?
Well, I think a lot of people have, when they may have retained an undetectable viral load, which is great, and they may have pretty good T cells, but a lot of people are dealing with multiple side effects on a daily basis, and it's pushed people out of the workforce earlier than they'd planned. You know, some people in their 30s or 40s, and they've been put onto a pension, and I think as a result of that, they're not getting that interaction with workmates or forging friendships in the workplace. So that's an issue there. And I also, when there's an impact on people's self-esteem, then they're not as confident in a social setting, so they're not going out socially as much as well. And then when you bring along COVID, then you've got the double whammy that you just referred to, Susan, where we're forced into isolation. So it's compounding that isolation. People are already isolated, already with what I've just described, and then they've got the COVID thing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of things stopped, life stopped during COVID, and I've realised that because I was very, very lucky when I started antiretrovirals, I didn't have any side effects, and I went back into the workforce and was working overseas constantly, and was very, very active. And now I'm home, I'm retired, I'm alone, and it's like, where is this life that I wasn't
stimulation?
And I wasn't supposed to even live this long, and here I am, and meds just keep working for me, and it's like, well, it's like we have to recraft a future that we didn't think that we might have.
Exactly.
Which is both, I think it's always frightening, joyous, but a little scary.
Sure.
The journey never ends with HIV, and for me, even though I think there is going to be hope after COVID, I really hope that the people newly diagnosed realise how much more positive the future can be for them and how they can live long, normal lives. But for me, today's always about the people I've lost, and forever they're going to be holes in my heart, and sometimes I feel like, will I be the last one standing? And that's a little scary, but I wish to pay tribute to them on a day like today, a night like tonight, because they're the people who had it really tough, and many of them, certainly in Asia and some of my African friends, were the first ones to speak out and to lobby and to push governments to change policies and get access to antiretrovirals to people. So I want to remember them tonight.
I think that's very well said, Susan. I'm a similar take on what this is about, the remembrance, and friends that in some cases I felt I haven't been able to replace that type of friendship, and a couple of them in particular were real campaigners for us for our quality of life at the time and fast-tracking medication. And so, yeah, we're indebted to them, and you know, it just brings all that up, and there'll just be times at random where you'll think about somebody and special time you'd spent with them 20 years ago or whatever it was. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Susan and John, for that very personal account of that time. Now, this is one that I'm really excited about. LowRez Choir are going to sing Fix You by Coldplay.
When you try your best but you don't succeed, when you get what you want but not what you need, when you feel so tired but you can't sleep, stuck in reverse, and the tears come streaming down your when you lose something you can't replace, when you love someone but it goes to waste, could it be lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. And high up above and down below, when you're too in love to let it go. But if you never try, you never know just what you're worth. Lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. No, 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 tears stream down your face when you lose something you cannot replace. Tears stream down your face, and tears stream down your face. I promise you I will learn from my mistakes. Tears stream down your face, and lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you.
To me, Candlelight Memorial is a reminder of the millions who lost their lives to AIDS. Whilst we've come a long way in 40 years, it was the lost lives that paved the way for those living with HIV today. On this day, I remember them.
The Candlelight Memorial is really important to me because it enables us to remember all those people that we have lost over the many years to HIV and AIDS. I want to share a personal story with you about a boy called Paul. I met him in the early 1990s when I was an intensive care nurse at Royal Melbourne Hospital. Unfortunately, he developed an AIDS-defining illness and he was dying of pneumonia. The really sad and heartbreaking story of Paul was, yes, he was dying, but he was also dying very alone. He only had his mother as a support system, and even then she did not know that he had HIV or he was gay. And he said to me before he became unconscious and finally died that it was really so sad for him to be dying alone and not his authentic self. And in that moment, I felt that I always had to be that advocate for a person like Paul. No one should ever die alone, and no one should ever feel they can't be their authentic self. And that's why I'm a big advocate for people living with HIV, and that is why the Candlelight Memorial tonight is such an important event.
Like many other events in this new COVID normal world that we are now living in, we've had to learn to do things differently. Thank you for joining us in this year's virtual Candlelight Memorial. And thank you to our guests. Thank you Positive Women Victoria, Joy 94.9, Australia's only LGBTIQ+ community-owned radio station, all of our speakers, Susan Crowe, Judith Gorst, John and Susan, the LowRez Choir conducted by Ursula Pays, and the staff and amazing volunteers from Living Positive Victoria. And last but not least, all of you watching this from your homes. Thank you and good evening.